Hi, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of Green Steve's, the podcast Making Solar Simpler. As ever, I'm joined by Stephen Sorrell, and this week and this month we're here with Peter Walker. Peter is an associate consultant at Apse, but primarily, Peter, you are a developer of renewable and energy storage projects. Is that right?
That's right. Yep. Heavily involved in solar, but more recently involved in energy storage projects all over the UK.
Brilliant. So, why don't we start right there and right at the beginning? So, in terms of local authority appetite for these projects, how have you seen that sort of change? How do you view that in today's market?
I think there's been a proliferation of interest. I think that when we first started looking at local authority opportunities back in 2013, I think there was a voyage of discovery that was required. It was deemed as a very, very complicated area of project development, many moving parts. There were only a few trailblazers who were embarking on that journey. But over time, we've seen a lot more authorities looking at their land assets and to see what might have potential for development for solar. They haven't all been ground mounted or large scale either. You know, we've also looked at some rooftop stuff, how deployment could be affected on commercial rooftops, leisure centres, a full range. And frankly, I've lost count of how many local authorities we've consulted with, but it must be well into the 20s or 30s, I would imagine. Steve Sorrell may know more about that.
Oh, it's well more than that, Peter.
Actually, really?
In fact, you're forgetting. Peter was actually involved in the very first project, Steve, in Cornwall Council when I was the director down there, and he did all the financial modelling and some technical advice. That was 2009-10, Peter, that was. Wow. And of course, that was the first one built out by a local authority in the UK. They didn't build it till 2012, but it was the very first project. So we've been there right from the start.
And all the complexities were in there in that project. You know, the fact that we needed glint and glare studies, and it was in the pioneering days. I mean, when I started in solar in 2009, the feed-in tariff had just been launched.
Yeah.
It was so badly designed; it actually contributed nothing in terms of stimulating the market because the rates were too low. And it wasn't until 2010, really, that the feed-in tariff started to have enough bite at a high enough rate that it supported investment. And of course, we all then saw the explosion of private sector solar development. And I was lucky enough to be taken along that journey as well. But I think in terms of the public sector, I think typically they've wanted to watch private sector investment and to see what happens, to then say, well, actually, this seems to be a good thing. It seems to work, and have picked up the mantle. And we're now seeing quite a lot of very exciting projects of decent scale. You know, we've been modelling 5 megawatt peak, 10 megawatt peak, 15 megawatt peak, and indeed, you know, we're looking at an estate at the moment where one of the sites is going to take 25 megawatt peak, which is a significant solar investment. You know, it's a very, very big project. And so definitely there's been a progression and there's been an education process. And now, you know, we're meeting with people who have already, you know, they understand it. They understand what the technology is and how it works, and which is great because we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we talk to them.
But sorry, Steve. I think both Peter and I, though, do think that local authorities have been a bit slow in the take up on this, because in those early days they were genuinely pioneers. So when Wrexham Council, for example, had a £20 million budget to put 3 megawatts of solar on 3,000 council houses, that was a real pioneering project. But as Peter says, many years have passed in between. And if you look at the list, there's about between 20 and 25 local authorities that have built or own a solar farm. And when you look at the proliferation that Peter's talked about in the private sector of what we're now talking 15 gigawatts, aren't we? 15,000 megawatts, of which the vast majority is ground-based. I do feel they've been left behind a little bit. And I suppose, obviously, they're our clients and we love them, of course, but they really need to get on with this, because the business case still works very well. Peter may mention a little bit about battery storage later on, how that can enhance it. And they still have the assets and they still have the access to low cost capital. So I can't really quite understand why they're not literally queuing up to get these projects developed.
No, so let's explore it, because that's been my take too. Because I think, as you say, I think the private sector's completely kind of overtaken, in a way, the sort of progress that the public sector's made. And you describe things now, I describe things now to my public sector clients that are pretty old hat in the private sector, but are kind of seen as groundbreaking in the public sector. So there aren't that many public sector entities that sort of have done optimization PPAs with co-located battery storage. There aren't that many local authorities that have done synthetic power purchase agreements for the difference, whereas actually they're really widespread in corporate PPA offtakes.
Yeah.
And so what do we think is stopping that? Do we think it's not part of the normal kind of business of local authorities, and just all looks a bit terrifying from the outset? Because, as you say, they were trendsetters at the beginning.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's maybe a combination of things. I think a certain level of risk aversion is one, and fear of the unknown, but also I think that the people who tend to be involved in the project development come from two areas within the authorities. One is from estates, because they've built stuff, and the other comes from energy. And of course, they tend to be more on procurement or managing energy or making energy more efficient. Well, energy efficiency and energy generation are completely different disciplines. And so I think that's where you've got those two different skill sets within an authority. There's still quite a big gap when it comes down to the location, the design, the planning process, the land interests, the operational revenue assumptions, the cost assumptions. All of those things are a bit alien to them, and so it takes a long time to get them up to speed and to get them comfortable. Of course, ultimately, the power is wielded by the guy in finance or girl in finance, and therefore, it can be as practically well tuned as you like, but if it doesn't pass muster in terms of investment returns, it's not going to get anywhere near a committee decision.
And the summary from that, Steve, is this, isn't it? It's a team effort. It has to be a team effort. And we always say this, Peter and I, in our work as consultants, you need legal, finance, procurement, estates, planning, highways. All these different departments need to be on there. And what I normally try and do, as Peter well knows, is get them all together at the start in a bit of a kick-off meeting, have a bit of a talk about it, explain what all the different stages are, so everyone can see what's coming down the line, and making it clear that each of them has a contribution to make to that individually. So procurement on procurement, legal on legal issues, etc. But they also have a collaborative contribution in terms of supporting each other over some of the challenging bits. And all the ones that have been developed have always had a good team. But when it's the energy officer comes to us and says, oh, they've given this to me, it's an hospital pass, isn't it, for a single officer to try and do one of these on their own, when the DF and the chief exec and the legal, they've got all the power. So that's the point, isn't it?
So it would be good to explore that, because obviously there's a degree of risk aversion and there's a degree of lack of collaboration. I agree with that. And obviously some of that is not helped by things. And so the one you hear about in the news all the time is the Thurrock case with the 700 million, 1 billion kind of hole in the balance sheet, all of those bits and pieces. And so it would be good, I think, for people to hear some positive stories about some of the business cases that you've worked on, because, as you say, Steve, the one from my experience, most of these things do add up. They do look quite good.
Yes. Well, Peter, well, I mean, Peter and I have different contributions in the work that we do. He does the financial modelling. I try and keep the members in check and make sure everything's going on with the officers all on this team and they're all putting their shoulder to the wheel and stuff. But generally, the projects that we have advised on have come up with a decent, positive financial return, Peter, haven't they?
They have. I mean, the Thurrock debacle probably would require another hour of conversation, to be frank. But I think what is quite clear is that what the events of that particular piece of history have absolutely nothing to do with the technology that was deployed, or indeed the financial performance of the assets themselves. What was a problem on that program and that portfolio was more about valuations and how the projects were valued and the assumptions that were made that underpin those values, and the way that those values were then treated with regard to the investing authority, and that's got nothing to do with solar, and it's got nothing to do with the relative performance of a solar farm or a solar array, which is fairly simply put, it's how much does it cost, to run, and how much revenue does it achieve through the sale of electricity. And there are a number of different ways that you can sell electricity, and some are more valuable than others. But that's the key fundamental metric. And if the head of finance has got an investment threshold that he applies to any development that the authority is involved in, if the project surpasses that investment return threshold, then it's a good project. And that's the way that we try and present the business cases, is to say, we've been conservative on these assumptions. This has come from market. This has come from real evidence of operational projects. This has come from pricing in the market for wholesale pricing for electricity, and therefore it's a low risk investment, and it's got a term certain or as certain as you can be in terms of a return. These are great assets. They are very, very low risk.
Yeah.
They're very few moving parts once they're built, and therefore they're great at generating recurring income for an authority that is desperate for revenue. The way they look at their balance sheet is it's all outgoings, and this is an opportunity for them to invest in something that brings some incomings. So
if we talk about the two potentially different models that local authorities might use to develop one of these. So you have your kind of Cambridgeshire County Council type triangle solar farm, where they go hire EPC contractor, build and develop, go and develop your sort of solar farm, build it, and then operation and maintain and do direct kind of contracting. And then by contrast, you have your kind of buy from pre-existing developer type models. So your kind of auras, your grid serves, that type of model. Have you found kind of particular? I think one of the experiences I think I've had is that those buying from developers, and you either normally buy at kind of end of pre-development stage, or you buy kind of at the end of construction phase, but they take some quite quick decision making that doesn't always align potentially with some of the ways that local authorities make those decisions. Have you had kind of similar experiences with that? What are you seeing more of in the market? Are you seeing more of this kind of, we have land, we do it ourselves, or are you seeing more of that kind of arrangement?
I haven't seen much of the latter, for the very reason that you mentioned, which is by the time the opportunity has been presented and then the local authority has made a decision whether to act or not, the project's gone. Because if you've got a good project, by the very nature of that project, it's valuable in the market. So if the local authority can't make a decision quick enough, it'll go to somebody else. And we've been involved in advising some local authorities, and we've done due diligence on their behalf on some projects, some of which have been, frankly, basket cases in terms of their viability or whatever, and we've advised them to steer clear. But we've also advised where, they're good, solid projects, and yes, you should get involved. But as I say, by the time that it's gone through their committee process or their numerous subcommittees and committee process, the opportunity is lost. The successful ones have been where they've identified the opportunity partway through or towards the end of pre-development. So the land has been secured, the grid connection has been secured, the planning consent has been secured, and really it's just about saying, okay, now this thing can go into a procurement process. And you mentioned one developer there who would also offer up the EPC solution. So the authority isn't having to take on the construction risk. They're able to leave the construction risk with the developer, who gets rewarded for that, by the way. They're making a margin on the build of the project, but it means the local authority really has only got to have a watching brief, but ends up having the benefit of owning the asset when it's been commissioned, which of course is the Warrington model. And we know that Warrington have been very successful with their 3 acquisitions. And although they're not enjoying the stellar revenues that they were enjoying in 2021, 2022, that's a function of the market. That's got nothing to do with the quality or the yield of those particular sites. So I think, to answer your question perhaps more succinctly, I think buying operational assets, they're not nimble enough, and therefore if they want to get involved, they either should develop their own, which is obviously what we recommend, because that's how you maximize returns, or you look at something that's that the project rights, the risky bit, the front end risky bit has already been done.
Yeah,
surely the point. I mean, I know it's the Mandy Rice Davis response, isn't it? And we would say this, wouldn't we, as consultants? But the point is,
unusual story. Consultants want to do full development of project. Absolutely. But no, there is a valid point there. Absolutely.
But they need us. That's the point. They do need us. And I think that on that, we've tended to find that some authorities have struggled along on their own, and to be blunt, have done poorly. So their modelling's nowhere near the industry standard of what Peter can prepare, because they've never actually developed one. Or on other occasions, Steve, I don't know whether you realise this, but we had a local authority a couple of years ago, for example, who said, "Oh, great news! I've got a contractor who's going to give us some free work." And we're going, "Oh no, please!" They're just trying to sell you something. They've got a narrow view of things. And whatever you say about consultancy, they are independent. They work for their client, and they're trying to get the best from you. So my view has always been that you can, when people say, "Oh, well, we've never done this before, there's a risk associated with it, and we're out of our comfort zone," I accept all of those points, but you can procure the help you need to do it. And it doesn't have to be us. There's lots of different people out there, and the big consultancies are all over this, of course. And so there's always somebody to help you, but there's no excuse for not doing anything. And where Peter and I get really quite frustrated is, give you an example. We did one, again, in the last 2 years, we've done one, which was an 8-megawatt solar farm in the southeast, right next to an airport. And the airport had said it would buy the electricity. Still not developed. And you think, what are they?
That's unbelievable.
What are they waiting for?
Yeah, that is absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah.
So talking about, obviously, one of the key things in identifying, and sorry, probably the key thing is kind of really realizing your revenues and kind of really forecasting your revenues in the right way. And obviously that mostly comes down, one, to kind of reading the wholesale market, and two, the kind of power purchase agreement options that you've got. I mean, by and large, are you guys mostly seeing that these are deals with suppliers that have kind of either sort of some fixed term or some or effectively some kind of wholesale market tracking? I mean, there've been some more pronounced versions of sleeving. I know that City of London did one with their, I think it was the Voltalia solar farm in Dorset. I mean, my take is that sleeving is normally more painful than is worth the effort, and doesn't really save you things like grid costs. Obviously, there's a few with good private wire arrangements. What's your kind of takeaway, I guess, on some of those revenue options in today's market, and maybe also including CFDs, because obviously they're now more readily available with the annual auction round. I think the Triangle Solar Farm in Cambridgeshire actually has got one.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to your point with regard to prediction and forecasting on revenue, you can do two things. You can make an assumption about the current market, and then you can apply an indexation. So if we apply, and what we do that, we tend to do that because it's simpler to understand. You say, well, okay, what are you paying for, what's the wholesale market paying for power right now on export? And it's whatever, 7.5p or whatever. It's actually more than that right now, but what's it paying? How confident are we that price is going to prevail? And what sort of indexation would we prudently apply to that? And we have this debate constantly with finance teams around what is a prudent indexation on power pricing. But at the end of the day, it's about their appetite for risk. It's about saying, well, actually, we think that power pricing is going to index at 2%, just like RPI, or 3%, or 3.5%, or whatever. So that's kind of where people, I think, are most comfortable looking at it. And they say, well, how are we going to secure that? Well, you could go out and get yourself a short-term PPA at that kind of rate, or you could go out and get a long-term PPA, which would probably be discounted because of its longevity, but it'll give you some term certainty. I have to say that when we've got to the sharp end of actual contractual revenue, the clients tended to work more with the market. So they've looked at rates that come out of N2EX, for example. N2EX, which is a power exchange, which you can sell your power onto, or you'll do it through your licensed supplier, will sell your power into that market. And as wholesale prices go up, your revenue goes up, and as they go down, your revenue goes down. And I think the safety there is that, you're with the market, you're not against the market, you're not leaving money on the table. But by the same token, you're not going to get super profits, just because that, although funnily enough, when all the price hikes happened,
funnily enough, for the last 2 years,
funnily enough, solar farms did make super profits. But the point is when you're looking at forecasting now and trying to present some robust assumptions to an authority, it's about saying, this is your lowest risk position to take on revenue. Everything else is going to be upside. I think the whole sort of the supplier PPAs are really, you've just got to look at it on the basis that whatever happens, they're going to take a margin. So if you want the supplier to take the risk on pricing going forwards, they're going to price that risk. So if they price that risk, then you ain't going to get that in your revenue. But if you accept the risk, then you are going to get that in your revenue. And therefore it is about appetite. The big stuff that we've advised on is all on N2EX or Apex exchange, power exchanges, and they've done very well. They've enjoyed success. I think your other point around maximizing revenue, then clearly the big prize is being able to find a commercial end user that is local enough that you can private wire the energy to them, and you can sell it to them.
They'll carry on.
Exactly. And that they'll be around for whatever the contractual length or term is, where you're able to offer up power at a discount to retail, and that's it. Sleeving, I've always said sleeving is a bit like the emperor's new clothes. It sounds great, but when you dig into the logic of sleeving, where you have to transport energy over the network, you still have to pay to transport energy over the network. And therefore, the availability of discount is really only the margin that the licensed supplier would apply. And of course, that's regulated, and they can only put 5% on. So
and there's also the addition that I've never actually seen two sets of sleeving terms look the same. They really still are. It really still is a complete sort of basket case of kind of, I've seen some that are just effectively kind of just netting agreements where there is no true kind of sleeve, and then others are expressed in a completely different way. And I know they all come out the same, but they look wildly different. So you can add some extra transaction cost on top for figuring out what on earth's going on with it 9 times out of 10 too.
And indeed, then you've got to factor in the fact that you're going to have a whole bunch of legal costs.
Yeah, exactly.
To try and arrive at a set of contractual terms that both sides are happy with.
Yeah.
The sleeving deal that actually has been done doesn't actually create any financial benefit at all. No. It's purely a carbon benefit.
Yeah.
Our experience, though, Steve, is very, very, very little sleeving. Not much use on site, because there's four ways the power can go. Use on site, sleeving. Neither of those, because normally the sites are rural. And the other two, of course, are the ones we talked about: private wire and trading. And the private wire one is popular, Peter, isn't it? We're getting a lot of that. We just got a job in Scotland now, one of the Scottish authorities, that's got a hospital next door, and another, they've got an airport one as well. So that they're obviously good opportunities for a long-term PPA through a private wire, and the risk is lower with that than it is with trading. So that's it's very attractive to local authorities, that one.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, Peter, that point you alighted on is right too, which is the sleeving benefit is not a pricing benefit; it's a carbon accounting benefit normally. And understood. And then we should briefly touch on, mostly because I get 10 questions a day about them, but we should touch on regos for our listeners and kind of prices of regos and how you go about dealing with them and things like that. Have you got tips for our listeners? I think that's probably I'll leave it as open as that, because I get questions from all over the shop on regos these days.
I mean, again, you got to look at regos in two different ways. One is that they are, as exactly as they describe, a renewable energy guarantee of origin. If you are getting certificates that are you're getting rego certificates, they are coming from a real site that generates real renewable energy. So there's the carbon accounting again. From a financial point of view, it's free money. Why not? If you can go through the headache of accreditation, and it is an absolute headache.
It gets even worse with embedded battery storage as well. I'm having a nightmare on one of mine at the moment, which has got battery storage as well, and the ways that they kind of look at that, because obviously some of that then doesn't count as renewable, and it's absolutely agonizing.
Well, you wait until you've got one that's a DC coupled site.
Oh.
Because you're not even independently metering the solar component.
No, that's agonizing.
The metering is actually taking a smear of both PV and the batteries.
Yeah.
And Ofgem, their head explodes because they can't work out how this can work. The fact that you can have a SCADA system that can record pretty much everything. Anyway, we digress. Look, it's free money. I've just helped a client put their volume into rego into the rego auction, which happened yesterday. I think it was looking at about 10 quid per rego. I think because it's the last auction of the season, it might dip down a little bit, maybe at 8. But if you've got a decent sized solar farm, as I say, it's free money once you've got through the early accreditation. And as long as you register the volume on the CHP and renewables Ofgem website, you know how to use the portal, then it's fairly straightforward. You can, and as I say, you can't do both though. If you retire your regos in return for cash, you can no longer use the regos for carbon accounting.
Exactly.
So it is a decision that an authority has to make. And I have to say, some say, no, we'll take the green badge, and some say, no, show me the money.
Yeah.
Is it too purist an opinion, Steve, to say I really don't think they should be able to split it off from the power? But Peter's talking pragmatically. If it's your project and it's there and everyone else is doing it, of course you're going to do it, aren't you? But in principle, the principle just offends me that you can separate that off and sell it as something of value when it's not the actual power. It's very strange.
Yeah, it'd be interesting just to get your take on where do you think regos go as a pricing value over the next sort of 5 years? Because obviously the prices have actually been pretty good for the past sort of 2-3 years in my view, but I kind of see them trending down in the longer term as a projection, just on the basis as more renewables come onto the grid. You have to assume the prices are likely to dip to the point where then they're less likely to be valued, which I guess is a consideration in kind of business cases and things like that.
Yes, it is, and I think that, although it would be impossible to predict when we would reach saturation,
Yeah.
Just on market drivers, if there are less dirty emitters wanting to pick up regos, then the value is going to go down, right? It's
exactly.
Supply and demand economics.
Exactly.
So I think it'll go down. But what is interesting is that if you were looking at rego procurement from 3 years ago or 4 years ago, when it was, it wasn't really not worth bothering with. It was 77 pence a rego. I mean, now at 10 quid, it's seriously valuable. And I think that yesterday's auction is going to land one particular authority about 300,000 quid. And that is straight to the bottom line.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think as we retire aging fossil fuel plant, we'll see the value of regos going down. I don't think anybody bases an investment decision on the value of regos, and if they did, that's pretty foolish.
Yeah.
And therefore they are a little bit in the sidelines. Certainly, private sector to just treat them as a bit of bunts and a little bit of a bit of income on the side. But local authorities clearly see it slightly differently in terms of their carbon performance. And if you're sleeving renewable generation to yourself, and you are also able to prove through the REGO system where that energy has come from, then that is allowable in your carbon accounting. So it's a slightly different approach.
Can I sort of move the subject on a little bit, and I just briefly wanted to talk about both cannibals and batteries. So in terms of sort of the longer term future of solar, one of the risks that sort of much talked about, if not, I don't think always brilliantly understood, is this cannibalization risk that emerges, namely that if the sun's shining at one point in the UK, it's probably shining in a lot of places at the same time, which means that effectively you're driving power down. Or the price of power down. That tends to be forecast as a risk for emerging solar projects. The obvious mitigant to that is co-located battery storage. Are you kind of advising this as kind of standard across the board now, this co-located battery storage? And is it in response to cannibalization, or is it just it's good prudent economics because there are deviations in market power prices?
It's certainly not around cannibalization on the basis that if you look at total UK generation volume, solar's contribution is in the margin. We would have to have such a significant increase in solar generation before that started to happen. So I don't think that's the case. I think you would be you wouldn't be any better informed if you were looking at wind speed performance and trying to kind of apply some kind of predictability to wind speed performance and cannibalization of wind. But I think volatility is always going to come wherever you've got intermittency, and particularly from the large volume of wind on the system. But I think co-location or hybrid projects, which we model for local authorities. We don't go in there promoting them, but what we say is you should consider it. And although there is a heavier capital investment, and actually in some cases the return on that investment is very slightly lower, what energy storage does is it gives you an insurance policy for future operation. If we see a significant increase in volatility because of the electrification of heat and the electrification of transport, that volatility swing is going to be more pronounced, which means that your battery is going to be able to make you more money. It is also about leveraging your grid connection, because a solar farm is only producing 3% of its total annual output in the winter months, which means that effectively your grid connection is pretty much idle. So having a co-location with a battery means that the battery can be operating in the trading markets like Billio during the winter months and making you money, as opposed to, as I say, that grid connection sitting
wasted
there
grid connection,
idle. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, we don't recommend it. What we do is we lay it in front of an authority and say, here's the financial performance. It is going to be approximately double the level of investment, but here are the returns. If capital isn't a problem, from the future proofing of a particular project, I would suggest that storage is incorporated. But I'm biased in that I am a storage developer, so I know I know what the benefits are.
Normally, it's the grid picture, isn't it? It's getting the export elements, which aren't always available. But if as you say, if you can, of course, there's just on that, on a slight aside, Steve. There's one local authority, is it South Somerset District Council, I think, that has a battery farm without the solar. In actual fact, 30, 35, 40 megawatts. It's a big asset, and they just trade the electricity that way. They just charge the batteries up when it's cheap, and they discharge them when it's expensive. But it works lovely in co-location, and that's why you should always consider it.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Peter mentioned the magic word, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about it. But he mentioned the word grid connection. So I don't think it's possible to go through a discussion on solar without talking about grid connections. Obviously, lots of delays, lots of costs, lots of headlines about it. I think that's the slightly less interesting story, because I think a business case obviously turns on the cost and time of your grid connection, and we all know that, and it's a pretty important thing to bottom out before you get there. What I actually wanted to talk about was the extent to which you're seeing kind of active network management and constrained grid connections from the distribution network being offered now. So this is sort of not quite firm grid connections, and whether you're seeing a proliferation of this, and sort of, if so, kind of how you've been talking to your clients about that.
I mean, the level of grid connections that we tend to get involved in are comparatively small to the private sector stuff. I mean, however, having said that, there's been a statement of works trigger at just over 1 megawatt now in place for the last 2 years, and that has caused absolute chaos in the markets, because everything that you try and do has got to go through the statement of works process with National Grid. They're not letting the DNOs make any decisions in that regard until they've had a look at it.
Yep.
And that has caused a massive problem in terms of getting stuff through. Now, the new 5-point plan, the move away from first come first served to first ready first served is all great, but it has not yet shown its impact. It has not filtered through in the development process yet. They're still going through all of the old contracted connections, which is taking them far longer than they thought. Of course, the good thing is it is weeding out a lot of stuff that will never ever get to build, and so it is freeing up the queue to some extent, but that's not yet coming through. It is difficult. It is, the last thing that, or it's certainly one of the first 3 things that a project needs to pin down. And in terms of cost and logistics, it's quite often the one that chucks the project into the too hard pile. But to your point about curtailment and non-firm connections, I think there is less fear around accepting a non-firm connection, but it comes down to having somebody who can interpret the curtailment reports that come out of the DNO. So they'll send you a curtailment report, but if you don't know how to read it, and you don't know whether you're dealing with a 5% commercial curtailment risk or a 50% commercial curtailment risk, then you could be landing yourself in a load of problems. But I think, and certainly from my own point of view, is we are now looking at non-firm much more readily, doing our own analysis, and probability of that being an issue. And often it is only in a case where you've got an N-1 or an N-2 condition at a local primary substation or at a grid supply point. So I think it's people need to be a little bit more aware that curtailment isn't something to be scared of. And I think also that the revision to technical limits that is going on right now, and when I say the revision of technical limits, this is about the impact of storage on the network.
Yep.
I think that's going to push people far more towards co-location. They're going to look at batteries as a means of moderating their output so that they can comply with curtailment, or indeed they can achieve, they can get in within technical limits because they're using their batteries as the means of outputting energy into the network. So apologies if you can hear small people in the background, but our grandchildren are in the house and they're screaming the place down at the moment.
On that note, perhaps that's not a bad time to draw it to a close. So I just
Sure.
wonder if there's, just before the grandchildren take over entirely, Peter, and we so just maybe just a finishing thought. I mean, if you get the chance to kind of leave a message to the local authority listeners that we've got, the decision makers that we've got, and they're contemplating a solar farm, it feels like this is a big thumbs up from the group.
Well, I don't mind going first. I think a very short and pithy message is get on with it. I think that they've got to stop analysing and start doing. I think that's the key message.
And from my side, I mean, obviously the work we do with Apse as a membership organisation is trying to support its members and encourage. But the funny thing is, Steve, I've been doing this encouragement work with local authorities for an awful long time now. So I think we do need some of them to move it on a bit and be a bit more robust in their thinking and their commitment to it. But it is going in the right direction. But we don't want them to miss out on lots of opportunities in the interim by going slowly. So nobody's talking reckless here. We're just saying, get your advice, look at it in a timely fashion, and then if the green light is there, then do it.
That's brilliant.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I agree.
Absolutely great. Thank you both very much. Steve, thanks as ever, and Peter, thanks for joining us both. Next month we will be talking about opportunities for rooftop solar as opposed to solar farms, and so Steve and I will be back with another episode of Green Steves. But until then, do stay tuned to the Sharpe Pritchard website for more updates. Thanks very much.